The sun was sinking behind the dusty hills of Wyoming Territory when Caleb Turner stood alone in the middle of his dying ranch. The wind dragged across the dry fields like a whisper of bad news. Once, this land had been rich with tall grass and strong cattle. Once, men had envied Caleb Turner. Now the fences leaned like tired old men, the barn roof sagged, and the few cattle left wandered thin and weak. Caleb wiped sweat and dust from his forehead and looked across the land his father had built with blood and stubborn hope. The ranch was slipping through his fingers like sand. The bank had already sent warnings. One more bad season and everything would be gone. The cattle were sick. The grass had dried. The workers had left for better pay in other towns. Even the town folk had started whispering that Caleb Turner's ranch was finished. Caleb hated those whispers, but deep down he feared they might be right. A lonely life makes a man think too much, and Caleb had been alone for far too long. That was why, 3 months earlier, he had done something desperate. He had placed an advertisement in a newspaper for a mail-order bride. At the time it had seemed foolish even to him. What woman would travel across the country to marry a struggling cowboy with nothing but failing land and debt? But he had written the letter anyway. He told the truth. He said he needed a partner, someone brave enough to build a life on hard land. Weeks passed and Caleb forgot about it. Then one morning a letter arrived. The handwriting was careful but confident. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She wrote that she wasn't afraid of hard work. She wrote that life had taught her to survive worse than dry fields and broken fences. Her letter carried something strange, strength hidden between the lines. Caleb read the letter 5 times before answering. 2 weeks later she wrote again. Then again. Soon the letters felt like the only bright thing in his quiet evenings. And finally she wrote the last letter. I will arrive on the Tuesday train. Caleb had almost laughed when he read it. Surely she would change her mind. Surely a woman smart enough to write such letters would realize she deserved better than this dying ranch. But Tuesday came anyway. The small train station in town was dusty and half-empty when Caleb arrived. He leaned against a wooden post, hat low over his eyes, pretending he didn't care. Then the train screeched to a stop. Passengers stepped down slowly. Travelers, merchants, families. And then he saw her. She stepped onto the platform with one small suitcase and a calm expression. Clara Whitfield was not what Caleb expected. She wasn't dressed like a delicate city woman. Her boots were sturdy, her posture straight, her eyes sharp as if they measured everything around her. She looked at Caleb and somehow knew it was him before he even moved. She walked straight toward him like she had already decided her future. "Mr. Turner?" she asked. Caleb nodded slowly. "You're Clara." She gave a small smile. "I was starting to wonder if you'd changed your mind." Caleb cleared his throat. "I thought you might." She looked around the quiet station, then back at him. "I don't run from difficult things." Something about the way she said it made Caleb uneasy and impressed at the same time. The wagon ride back to the ranch was quiet at first. The road stretched through dry fields and broken land. Clara studied everything carefully. She looked at the fences, the cattle, the cracked soil. Most women would have looked worried. Clara looked thoughtful. Finally she spoke. "Your cattle are sick." Caleb frowned slightly. "You can tell that from the road. Their posture," she said calmly. "And the way they walk." Caleb glanced at her. "You know cattle." Clara simply said, little." When they reached the ranch house, the sun had already turned the sky orange. Clara stepped down from the wagon and walked slowly toward the barn. She studied the animals the way a doctor studies patients. Caleb followed her, confused. She touched one cow gently, then examined its eyes and mouth. Her face tightened slightly. "How long have they been like this?" she asked. Caleb crossed his arms. "Couple months. I've tried everything the town vet suggested." Clara stood quietly for a moment. Then she said something that made Caleb blink in disbelief. "They're poisoned." Caleb stared. "Poisoned?" She nodded. "Not intentionally. Your grazing land has a plant spreading through it." She walked toward the field and pointed. "That one." Caleb squinted. "That's just wild milkweed." Clara shook her head slightly. "Not exactly. It's a similar species that spreads in drought. Cattle eat it when grass becomes scarce. Slowly it weakens their hearts." Caleb felt a strange chill run through him. "You're saying that plant is killing my herd?" Clara met his eyes calmly. Yes. Caleb laughed once, but it was not a happy sound. And how exactly would you know that? Clara hesitated for a moment before answering. My father was a livestock doctor. Caleb blinked again. A veterinarian? Yes, she said softly. I worked beside him most of my life. Silence filled the barn. Caleb suddenly realized something incredible. This woman he had married through letters might know more about saving his ranch than anyone in the territory. But Clara wasn't finished. She walked back toward the field with determined steps. We can save them, she said. Caleb followed quickly. We. She looked back at him with a small confident smile. If you're willing to trust your wife. The word wife hung strangely in the air between them. Caleb scratched the back of his neck. All right. What do we do? Clara pointed toward the infected pasture. First we move the herd. Immediately. Then we burn the weeds. Caleb frowned. Burn half my grazing land. Clara shook her head. Burning will save the other half. Caleb looked across his ranch. The ranch he feared was already dying. For the first time in months, a thin thread of hope appeared. Maybe this strange woman had brought more than a suitcase with her. Maybe she had brought a miracle. That night, as the stars rose above the quiet land, Caleb watched Clara studying the fields with careful focus. The wind carried dust through the darkness, but for the first time the ranch did not feel completely doomed. And Caleb Turner began to realize something incredible. His mail-order bride had arrived with a secret skill, one that might save everything he had left. But neither of them knew that saving the ranch would also uncover secrets buried deep in Clara's past, secrets that could change both their lives forever. If you enjoy powerful Wild West stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our growing community of frontier storytellers. Because the next chapter of this story will reveal the dangerous truth behind Clara's past, and the shocking decision that will determine whether the ranch survives or falls forever. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the Wyoming plains, painting the dry land with pale gold. Caleb Turner had barely slept. The night had been filled with the restless sound of cattle shifting in the temporary pen they had built after moving them from the poisoned pasture. He sat on the wooden fence, staring across the ranch that had once been his pride and was now hanging by a fragile thread. But this morning felt different. For the first time in months, there was a plan. And that plan came from the quiet woman who had arrived with a single suitcase and a calm voice that somehow carried more confidence than any rancher Caleb had ever known. Clara stepped out of the ranch house just as the sun touched the horizon. Her sleeves were rolled up, and her hair was tied back in a practical knot. She looked less like a mail-order bride and more like someone preparing for battle. Caleb watched her walk toward the barn with determined steps. Morning, he said, jumping down from the fence. Clara nodded politely. Morning. The cattle need treatment before the sun gets too hot. Caleb followed her into the barn. The weak animals shifted slowly as Clara moved among them, checking their eyes and breathing with careful attention. Caleb noticed something he hadn't seen before. Her hands were steady, confident. She didn't hesitate the way most people did around sick animals. It was the kind of skill that only came from years of experience. She mixed a treatment using herbs and medicine from her bag, carefully measuring every drop. Caleb leaned against a post and watched. You really did work with your father, didn't you? He asked. Clara nodded slightly while working. Since I was 10 years old. Caleb raised his eyebrows. That long. She gave a faint smile. My father believed learning should start early. For hours they worked side by side. Clara showed Caleb how to treat the cattle and which animals needed the most attention. She also explained how the poisonous plant had spread because of the drought, slowly taking over the grazing land until the cattle had no choice but to eat it. By noon they were both exhausted, but something remarkable had already begun to happen. Some of the cattle were standing stronger. Others were eating again. It wasn't a miracle yet, but it was the first real sign of hope Caleb had seen in months. As they sat in the shade beside the barn, Caleb finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind since yesterday. Why did you really come here? Clara looked at him carefully. What do you mean? Caleb shrugged slightly. You could have stayed in the city. A woman with your knowledge could work for any wealthy ranch owner. Instead you answered a letter from a man whose ranch was practically dying. Clara looked across the land silently for a moment before speaking. Because sometimes starting over is easier far away from where people know your past. Caleb studied her expression. There was pain hidden behind her calm voice. Someone hurt you? He asked quietly. Clara didn't answer right away. Instead she stood and brushed dust from her skirt. We should burn those weeds before the wind changes. Caleb realized she wasn't ready to talk about it. And strangely, he didn't push her. Over the next several days, the ranch slowly transformed into a place of determined activity. Clara organized everything with surprising authority. They burned the infected pasture. They separated the sick cattle from the healthier ones. She even redesigned the feeding schedule to strengthen the herd. Caleb found himself working harder than he had in years, but for the first time the work felt like it meant something. The ranch hands from nearby farms began to notice something unusual. Word spread quickly through town. Caleb Turner's dying ranch was recovering. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, Caleb stood beside Clara watching the cattle graze safely in the new pasture. The herd looked stronger already. You saved them, Caleb said quietly. Clara shook her head. We saved them. Caleb smiled slightly. Still feels strange saying that. A week ago I thought I'd lose everything. Clara folded her arms thoughtfully. Your ranch wasn't dying because of bad luck. It was dying because no one knew the real problem. Caleb looked at her curiously. You mean the poison weed? Clara hesitated, then nodded, but something in her eyes suggested she wasn't telling the whole story. That night a rider appeared at the ranch gate just after dark. Caleb stepped outside with a lantern while Clara stood behind him on the porch. The rider was a tall man wearing a black coat and an impatient expression. His horse snorted as he pulled the reins tight. You Caleb Turner? The man asked. Depends who's asking, Caleb replied calmly. The man's eyes moved past Caleb and landed on Clara. His expression changed instantly. Well, he said slowly. I knew I'd find you eventually. Caleb felt Clara stiffen behind him. You know this man? Caleb asked quietly. Clara stepped forward slowly, her face pale but controlled. His name is Victor Hale. The rider tipped his hat with a cold smile. Good to see you again, Clara. Caleb glanced between them. What's going on? Clara took a deep breath. Victor Hale used to be my father's business partner. Hale laughed. Used to be. That's a polite way of saying she ran away. Caleb frowned. Ran away from what? Hale's smile widened cruelly. From a debt. Her father owed me money before he died. Clara's voice hardened. That's not the truth. Hale shrugged casually. Truth is flexible. Caleb stepped forward slightly. You didn't ride all the way here just to talk. Hale's eyes returned to Clara. No, I came to collect what's owed. The tension in the air thickened. Clara's voice was steady when she spoke again. My father didn't owe you anything. You tried to steal his veterinary practice. When he refused, you threatened him. Hale chuckled. And yet here you are hiding on a failing ranch. Caleb felt anger rising in his chest. He looked at Clara. Is he telling the truth about the debt? Clara shook her head firmly. No. Hale leaned forward in his saddle. Believe what you want, cowboy. But if she doesn't come with me, I'll make sure this ranch disappears faster than those sick cattle. Caleb stepped closer to the gate. You threatening my land? Hale's smirk faded slightly. Caleb opened the gate slowly and walked toward him. His voice was calm but dangerous. This ranch almost died once already. But not tonight. Hale studied Caleb carefully, realizing this wasn't a man easily intimidated. Finally he scoffed and turned his horse. Fine. Keep your runaway bride. But debts have a way of catching up. He rode away into the darkness. Silence settled over the ranch again. Caleb looked back at Clara. You want to tell me the rest of that story? Clara's eyes filled with emotion for the first time since she arrived. My father spent his life helping struggling ranchers keep their animals alive. Victor wanted to sell expensive treatments most farmers couldn't afford. When my father refused to cooperate, Victor tried to ruin him. After my father died, I left before Victor could destroy everything else. Caleb nodded slowly. And now he found you. Clara looked down. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring trouble here. Caleb surprised her by laughing softly. Clara, trouble arrived at this ranch long before you did. He gestured toward the recovering herd. But you also brought something else. She looked up. What? Caleb smiled. Hope. Weeks passed. The cattle regained strength. The grass began to grow again in the cleaned pasture. The bank withdrew its final warning after seeing the ranch recovering. Caleb Turner's land was alive again. One evening as the sun set over the peaceful fields, Caleb and Clara stood beside the fence watching the herd move slowly across the golden grass. Caleb cleared his throat awkwardly. "You know, when I wrote that mail-order advertisement, I was just hoping for someone willing to stay." Clara smiled gently. "And what did you get instead?" Caleb looked at her warmly. "A woman, who saved my ranch, and probably my life." Clara laughed softly. The sound carried across the quiet land like a promise of better days ahead. And in that moment Caleb realized something important. The greatest miracle Clara had brought wasn't just her knowledge. It was the courage to start again. Together. If you enjoyed this powerful Wild West story and want more emotional cowboy tales like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and join our storytelling family. Because the next story might be even more shocking, emotional, and unforgettable than this one.